In this video, we're going to look at plans for the Lotus 38 replica I made based on this car. These plans aren't exactly what I did on the other car. I've tried to update them a little bit, but I'll talk you through what I've got different on these plans and why, or why you might want to do what I did on the original car. Part of the reason that these plans are different is I don't have nearly all of it here with me, but I found a ton of plans and things like this. This is a scale template for a structure inside the footwell. I had these for all kinds of different parts on the car, but the overall plans I had weren't accurate to what I built. They were earlier versions, and I could tell looking at the dimensions, like, what? Wait, I don't think that's right. And I went and measured the car. I'm like, no, that's not right. The plans that I made when I made the actual car, the finished plans were the quarter scale mock-up that I made out of paper, and I would disassemble that to then get the dimensions for the different panels I needed, and then reassemble it. And so by the time the car was finished being made, that thing was getting pretty delicate, and then I moved, and it's this big and made of paper and ready to fall apart, so I just threw it away. If I needed to repair something on the car, I would use what's on there now as the template. And then I also have a lot of templates. This was actually an early draft of the template for the front bulkhead. This was an early draft of the template for the rear bulkhead. This was the actual template I used for the rear bulkhead. This was the actual template I used for the front bulkhead. And see, it says use this side. You would, when you were drawing, this side looked a little better, so you'd use this, and then to get the other side, you'd flip it over and use that. This is the bulkhead, the second bulkhead from the front, template for it. So I had a ton of stuff on it, but in piecing together what was right in the plans I had and what had changed, I also looked at all the things that I would do differently if I was going to do it again. There's things I'd like to change on the car now, and part of the thing that stops me from doing it is I look at it and think, maybe I should just redo the whole chassis. It wouldn't cost that much in materials, and I have all the expensive stuff, the engine, suspension, and all that, and I could just bring it over. That might be something I do one day. There are other things you're going to see. I've got another video coming out about a car I recently designed that I really want to build. But going through this, it'd be interesting to build something like this again. So we're going to go through the drawings I did. I want to start, though, with a few things that are hard to tell on the drawings. It would help if I made some three-dimensional sketches, but it's already taken me a long time to get what I've got here together, and I want to get this video out to you, and you get what you pay for. Something that's going to be hard to see on the drawings is the 38 has this interesting thing in the sides, in the inner walls, the sides of the cockpit, so this is the floor. Sorry, this is beat up. This is from my original mock-ups of the car. This isn't the finished one that I made it with. But anyways, this is the front of the car. This is the firewall bulkhead. The engine would be behind here. You sit in here. The seat comes down to about here. The gauges would be around here. From forward of this bulkhead, the outer skin curves over this. This is all like one structure. But in here, the metal's doing this weird thing, which the original did, and I tried to mimic it as much as I could. I'm going to explain why I didn't do it exactly the way they did it. But it's got this diagonal fold so that this edge here is flat. Your arms hang over this. This is flat, but as it goes up, it gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and this edge here is at a 45-degree angle coming out to meet the outer wall over here. And then, to make this a little clearer, I have a mock-up of that second bulkhead, which would fit in here like that. Excuse the crudeness of all of this. So this is doing something like that. And obviously I hadn't figured out the right lengths here, so this is going out further than the bulkhead. This here needs to meet this curve at some point because the skin is going to go out there. And again, apologies that I didn't make a new, more accurate one, but I'm going to point this out on the drawing so you understand what's going on there. So the thing is, if you're looking at this from the top, this kind of just looks like it's flat, but actually it's these two angles that are going on. I'm even having a hard time, there you go, holding the paper so you can see how that works. The trickiest thing, and this is why I didn't do it exactly the way they did it on the real 38, is this edge here. This is supposed to be like a 1-inch flapper. It could be 3/4 inch, but this is for rivets to rivet against the skin, and this is, coming up at an angle. That means technically, especially if you have a compound curve, this edge needs to curve and this fold needs to happen on a curved line, which you can do on an English wheel. That's not the biggest. Doing a curved fold isn't the hardest thing, unless you don't have an English wheel. But the problem is I don't know how to mathematically get this curve right, because it's angling up and this is curving in different ways. So the only way I would know how to do it would be to make a buck with cross sections and then figure out this curve on the buck. There's probably a mathematical way to do it, but I don't know it. Or I suppose you could do it in CAD and then just have measured points and figure the curve out that way. So what I did was I did the same basic thing, but I didn't do any compound curves on the side of my car, which incidentally, I recently read a quote from Robin Hurd of McLaren, who said they started off using compound curves because Lotus was using them. And then they found out they were a terrible idea. And he doesn't say why. I'm assuming it's for structural reasons. So you could say it's because you know better rather than because it's too complicated for you to do, like it was for me. So what I did was, this is just a straight line, and I've just figured out how to make my curve. I wrapped the skin around and made it so that there was a straight line from whatever point it met here to back here. Now this is all curved, but I just had to make sure that I had a straight line between these 2 points in the curve, and kind of up here too a little bit, but not as much. The way the skin is, you've got a skin coming up to here, and then it's coming up over here. You can have this part be at a slightly different angle than this part. That is something, if you do the sheet metal way, that you'll have to figure out. If you're planning on doing this with tube steel, you don't have to do it that way. And if you're doing it with sheet metal, you could do it just like a Lotus 25 or 33, where the sides are just straight and you don't have that, and then there's just body work on top. If you're interested in a 49, it's kind of a cross in that it's a simpler structure than the 38 was. It's more like it's just the two booms going down the side, the two fuel tanks. But rather than having a fiberglass body on top, it's actually enclosed with bodywork and has some neat little things around the cockpit, so it's all one solid tub. Of course, the downside to making things, which they knew at the time, the designer Len Terry had this argument with Colin Chapman. The downside to having it enclosed is it's harder to work on. You don't have access to things like you'd like, but it makes it stiffer. So let's look at some drawings. So let's start here looking at the profile, the side view. It gets complicated here because this is all a curved surface, and looking at it in 2 dimensions can be a little confusing this way. I'll put images of these. I'll put a link in the description to a zip file that's got JPEGs of all of these, so you can look at them. These are quarter scale. Each square on the graph paper is a 1/4 inch, and it represents an inch here. So even if you don't see me putting a measurement here, you can just count the squares. And I try to do everything to the inch or 1/2 inch. If you've got like a diagonal line, usually the safest way to calculate that is when you're actually doing your piece out. You could use a calculator to do a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or I just I would measure this height and this length, and then you connect those and you're going to get the right length, and you're doing that actually at scale on the piece you're going to cut. That way you don't have any transposing errors, and because I'm just doing this on graph paper and it's quarter scale, I really don't like measuring this with a ruler and then multiplying that times 4, because if you're a little bit off, you're now getting your error multiplied times 4. So on the 38 I built, this here is aluminum. Mine actually goes further out here. The tub comes all the way out to here, and this structure here for the front suspension, this thing, actually sits out in front, and it makes the car too long. And it was because I didn't want to try to squeeze the pedal box into this space here. But now I believe that's actually the right thing to do. But if your feet are bigger than size 11, you're probably going to need a bigger space here. The problem is you're going to have rocker arms mounted here, and so they need to have the springs in here. So you need room for those springs to go down, and that's kind of the limiting factor here. I should say the plans here, I've made the car taller and wider than I made my car. And that's because I got actual dimensions for the car. I didn't have dimensions. I figured things out as best I could and found out that the actual car was 2 inches wider and 1 inch taller. And I could really use that space in the car. If you're an average size adult, you probably could too. Here's what I was talking about with my demonstration, where it's hard to understand what it is that's happening here. But we're going to look at that some more when we look at the front view of the car. So I've also changed the roll center height. I had a roll center height of 3.5 inches in the front on mine originally, and I've lowered it by screwing with a few things. But here I've planned for something closer to 2 inches to still keep it kind of period correct, but get a little more grip out of it. On mine, so this box here, I was originally planning on putting the battery inside here. Oh, that's something I had on other race cars. And this came out further because this was all further. You had, this area here was longer. So this tube, which is where the back end of the lower control arms is going to connect to, this was a little further. It was about 7 inches forward of here, and so this thing was bigger. The thing is, I found I only had this 3 inches tall. Maybe you could make this taller. Your legs are going to kind of go up and down, so you could have this taller maybe, but I just found I wasn't going to be able to put a decent size battery in there. So I elected to just leave it as a structure. What it's doing is it's supporting this. I just have this as a steel tube with kind of bracket ends coming out that have a hole in it that I've got threaded tubes going to with rod ends. And what this is doing is feeding the braking force loads from there into the rest of the chassis. And so it's being fed in, this way through rivets all along here. And it's also being taken down and fed through at the bottom here. And then this here is a bulkhead. I measured, and it looks like you could get away with, if you had this arrangement, putting this tube all the way back here at the bulkhead. The reason I didn't is I have my bulkhead just as sheet metal here. There's no like roll hoop or anything, which means if we're talking about fore and aft forces for braking, we want material going that way. So I like the idea of having something here to add rivets going in that way for feeding the force in. So my original idea was that a battery was going to go in here and this was all going to be this kind of one thing. What I ended up doing, because I needed somewhere for the fire suppression system, is I put the extinguisher tank in here, and that makes the area for your legs to go over. And so this here is really, it's this structure here is really just stiffening between the two sides. But it's nice for your legs. It keeps you from submarining if you were in a crash. This here is where your gauges are, and your steering column is going to go through here somewhere. Mine actually, on the one that's already made, comes through and goes down here. The downside of that is it's going between the brake and clutch pedal, which means you can never left foot brake. And I really like left foot braking, so it would make sense to find a way to either feed this up higher, or the other thing you could do is have it come down here and actually put the steering column down here, or use it even as a footrest for the pedals, and then have it come down here and attach. It would be a rear steer rather than a front steer on the wheels. So an original has the gas tank, has the fuel kept in the sides of the car. And the original, being an Indy car, had to carry quite a bit of fuel. It's safer to just use the structure of the seat, and I've got a standard ATL 5-gallon Formula Car tank in here, and it's actually smaller than the angle I'm using here. So if I had one custom made by them, I could probably get 6 or 7 gallons, but I find I've never quite used 4 gallons of gas in a 20 or 20-minute track session, as I think what we usually get. So this is plenty for me, and I do a lot of autocrossing, and I use a gallon all day long. So that's what I have. You could play with this angle here of however you would fit in the seat best. And then from the top of the fuel tank here, I have lines going to a pump in the engine, but then also a big thing, and I've got a fuel filler cap here. The original had its fuel inlets here because this is all part of the tank and on each side. Okay, let's talk about my famous chicken cheating thing. So when I decided to build this car, I didn't know how I was going to do the rear, and I was thinking I was too scared to do this as aluminum because I was just going to be putting a road car V8. I knew it was going to be pretty darn heavy. So I kind of thought I would like to do it just like any Formula car you saw and just do a simple steel trestle structure here so that you had access, and I would try to make it so it wasn't too visible, so it almost looked like it had a stressed engine in the back. It would look more like a Lotus 49. But I don't even remember when I changed my mind about that. But we'll get to what I did, but what I think I would do just to modify this basic idea. So the engine mount, the motor mount on each side is where this cross member is, and it's about 6 inches from the bottom. It might be lower because my oil pan actually sticks out down here. I've got a floor, but I've got a hole where the bottom of the oil pan is. But because the way the engine is here, that's why, and the suspension, the spring perch is back here, that's why you've got this tube and tension triangulating that load. So the engine is pulling straight on that tube to the structure that's got the spring perch on it. And then the other way to the other side. If I was less of a chicken, what I would have just done, though, is just riveted sheet metal across I still would have had the steel structure, but I just would have riveted sheet metal either on one side or the other, and it would have done all the triangulating for me. But I was new to this at the time. So what I ended up doing, if we look at it from plan view here, I had these 2 tubes. I've got them 20 inches apart here. On the one I built, they're actually only 17.5 inches apart, which isn't quite enough space. So I don't have a panel on either side of this because I needed that space, like the starter fits in between the tubes and little bits on the adapter plate, and just the end of the block are actually going past the tubes here because I made it too tight. So on these drawings, I widened that to 20 inches, also helped by the fact that I found out the width of the car was actually 2 inches wider on the real one. So I had these a little narrower, and then what I did, because I ended up making a rear bulkhead, and actually this drawing isn't totally accurate to what I did. I've got another drawing. We're going to look at that in a second. But what I ended up doing is then just doing, these were 1.5 inch tubes. Then I just put 1 inch tubes out here and covered it in aluminum and put a curve on it going down just to kind of fill it in and make it look like it was a monocoque all the way back. Had I planned that from the start, it would have made sense, assuming you can get aluminum pieces long enough, to have this inner wall be all one piece and come all the way back and rivet across here, or on the outside as well. This arrangement in the rear, this is closer to what I did on the GT40. On my 38, this is quite a bit further back. It's back here and it's straight. And the drive shafts, the output shafts and drive shafts come out around here. And again, that was part of the reason for using the tube structure. Was a lot of these race cars from the period, they could have their rear bulkhead back here and the Hewland gearbox just hung off the back of it. With the Audi box I was using, it needed to be supported out back here. So I had the structure coming out here, and it obviously had to have an opening, so having this all be sheet metal wasn't practical. But then, looking at cars, you see a lot of monocoques have this kind of steel tube scaffolding in the back to hold the gearbox if they can't just hang it right there, or even if they can sometimes. Because the T-Bird knuckles I'm using in the rear for the rear uprights are triangular shaped, which I wasn't planning to use originally. I was going to use GT40 style uprights, and I just found these were cheaper and more readily available. So I ended up, again, with this bulkhead being back here, having to do a bunch of spacers on the upper link to get it to be straight above where I had the lower part. So here, angling this means I could attach, rather than attaching from here, I would attach on this side for the lower control arms be here, and then the upper control arm here, and the drive shaft come out right here. The other thing that this helps with is these gearboxes, because they've got their output shafts on the bottom, they have a bit of a bulge right here. So it's nice to have this open area for that bulge to go down into. So this is about as short as I can make this and still have room for the bell housing to come up here. And this to be more underneath where the gearbox meets the engine, which doesn't have the bulge. The bulge happens down here, and that means you don't have to have this quite as high. All right, let's look at the plan view a bit. So here, we're going to look at a better drawing of this because I don't have these tubes in the right place here. I think I was drawing this trying to get kind of the outer edges of it, and then I realized, wait, I have a tube connecting this kind of H pattern right on top here. And so anyway, we're going to look at a different drawing for that. So we've got the steel here. This is a steel bulkhead. This is the seat area where it's reclined. This is this part. This is where the gauges go. This is bulkhead. This is this bar down here that's got the arms coming back from the lower control arms, and then your pedal box in there. So something that's different here, this is closer to how an original is, where this here angles in. On the one I built, I didn't do that. Because mine's a little narrower than this is in a little bit more, but I just made it straight. And because it's straight in here, these sponsons are thinner, which means they're not as strong. They wouldn't be as stiff, and if you were going to put fuel in them, they'd hold a lot less fuel. It's been plenty strong. It's been great. But if I was going to do it again, I would try to do this to make it stronger and be a little more faithful to the original. The downside is going to be if your feet are bigger than size 11 shoes or 45 European, you're going to need more space in here. So that may mean you either don't want to angle in as much, or you do what I did before and you just come straight out. The problem is then figuring out how to have enough space in here for the coilover spring and shock. And the more space you have, the more, this is going to be a rocker arm. So, I don't think you want a ratio of like 2 to 1. I think you want a ratio more of like 1.5 to 1. But that's something for you to figure out. Or if you want to just forego the whole rocker thing, you could do whatever you wanted here and mount your springs from here and have them go down to the lower control arms, which, that other cars did that way. There's pros and cons to the rocker. It's can be what they call an undamped spring. So from a suspension standpoint, it's not the best, but it's aerodynamic. You don't have the coilover spring in the airflow. Of course, the plus side of having the coilover in the airflow is it's kept cool that way. Well, and then what's not on the drawings here is ahead of this you would have some brackets coming out for a radiator, and obviously your master cylinders would be here. On the one I built, because I had this whole assembly in front and the structure coming all the way to it, I have my brake master cylinders and clutch master cylinder are inside this assembly up here, and we'll look at, in fact, let's look at that right now. I haven't made an updated drawing on this, so this is from my original, but this shows how I did the two pieces of this structure here. This is, these would be, this is up and down, this is side to side, this is the front, this is the rear. So I had this thing where I just put I wanted a solid piece of steel going all the way across on the top and bottom, connecting both sides of the suspension. It was just, You know, the first time I'd done anything like this, I felt comfortable having a nice piece of steel in between. Then these were just 1-inch tubes that I added to make this 3-inch thing all be the same, all be flat, because this is where I mounted the master cylinders. And the reason this comes down here, which seems kind of weird, you know, I would have loved to have a straight piece of steel there, but I needed them to come down because the master cylinders sit here. They're bolted to this, and then the front of them is sticking out over this thing that comes down. And this here is the bottom of the car. That's why this is a 1/2-inch tube, that was how much space I had. There was 2 inches from the bottom of the frame to where this pickup point was. And then the lower control arms, you know, bolt in here. This triangulation here is because the spring, it was originally I designed it so the spring mounted here and went up to the rocker here. And this was me trying to use one piece to do multiple things. So there was a bolt that went through here, all the way through here, all the way to the body. And in between I had spacers, and that had the rod end for the lower control arm coming out. It also had the spring going to it. But what I found was this just wasn't enough space. I couldn't get springs, or I couldn't get shocks. I couldn't get coilovers that were short enough to fit in there. So then what I ended up doing was adding some brackets down here so that they came down here, and that gave me some more space, allowed for a lower ride height. Before we look at the front, because that's going to be a whole other thing, let's look at this rear bulkhead. So this is what I was talking about. The if you look over here, these tubes coming back, they all fit inside this rectangle, and this here is removable. I have brackets. I actually have double brackets because I was being doubly safe, I guess. It was overkill. You don't need that, but you would have brackets here so this fits in and has bolts going through it, bolting all this together. But you want to be able to take this out so it's easy to get the engine and gearbox in and out. So I'm kind of boxing off this shape, but then I want my upper control arms and my spring perches to be further out than the lower ones. So I'm making this not quite hexagonal trapezoid kind of shape. And then, because I'm just using straight tubes, then you could use aluminum and just do kind of a cover plate, which is what I did, or you could just do sheet steel and actually weld it in. But you want to give it this curve so that your skin has a nice curve to rivet to. Here, so on mine, I actually have brackets coming out for the spring perch, and it's kind of low. The higher you can have that spring perch, the less angle you're going to have for it going down the suspension. So you might want to put something coming up here. You've got to be careful, though, to make sure that the top of your coilover doesn't foul against here. I use Avos. They've got nice small coilovers. But I think on that car I actually have QA1 shocks. I get them to fit. Sometimes if you run them upside down, you end up with more clearance. And some guys run them upside down to get more unsprung weight because it puts the body of the shock on the chassis side rather than the suspension side. But in this case, it's just something to try for clearance. But you're going to want to have them on hand when you, whatever you're going to use, when you do these brackets, so you know it's not going to foul. Using the T-bird knuckles, if you use any kind of modern car rear knuckle upright thing, the lower control pickup point in the suspension is going to be kind of high. From a structural standpoint, we want it down here where it's supported side to side, but it has to be up here, which isn't supported, which is why I add these brackets here, so it's kind of supporting that better. I had this drawn in to show that you might, I have this as a 1.5 inch tube. You might need to cut into this to make clearance for the gearbox. You might even have to do more than that. It's something that you need to figure out. Or if the gearbox is going to be so low that, and it's got that dumb bulge in it, if that bulge is in your way and you need to really not have that there, you could support it another way by, you've got this out here, you could then put maybe another one in here so that this is supported in the front and the rear. And that's not going to be great. It's not going to be anywhere near as good as if it were a straight line here, but it's sometimes you've got to make compromises to make it work. And that's a way you could do that, and it would still be plenty stiff. You can always just use thicker metal, which adds weight. It's not the best way to do it. We want to find geometry that lets us use less material and have it be lighter and as rigid as possible. But when you can't do what you need to do because things are in the way, a thicker piece of metal can be a Band-Aid. I have my pickup points drilled and sleeved into these tubes, but if you know anything about roll centers, having a longer control arm makes your roll center more stable. So you might want to just like weld a tube in here, like instead of putting a sleeve inside this hole here, just weld the sleeve on the outside, and you could use this bracket to help support it. That could give you a little more throw on it. And then for the trailing arms, try to just get them to this bulkhead, and you can just make brackets that you rivet to the side and have the trailing arms go to that, or you can weld things like, I said I had metal tubes in here, so I could weld things right in here, but you could weld them right on the end of the bulkhead. Would be a great way of tying the forces from the wheels into the structure of the car. Sorry, my head keeps getting in the way. Okay, one more drawing we really need to look at. So this drawing is showing, I can't quite get it all on the screen, but I'll try to get the picture of it right. This is actually full scale. Here, each of these 1/4 inch squares represents a 1/4 inch. This is a full scale. You can use a ruler on this and it'll tell you exactly where things should be. Because I've got these curves, I would probably pick for each of these. Is showing the front bulkhead, the second bulkhead, and the firewall bulkhead. I would probably pick which of these looks best. If I was making a template, I would pick one side and then I would flip that over to do the other side. But for here, what I'm trying to accomplish with these is, one, I talked about that section with the weird angles on it and how it needs to connect here, and that's what this line represents. I'm trying to get it so that we've got kind of a straight, it's curved, but kind of a straight line between the points of these three things, so we don't need to shape the metal with an English wheel or something. This is, again, a little bit wider and a little bit taller than my car, so I couldn't use my templates. I had to make it again. But this gives you an idea. Here, let's see if I can show. Going all the way up to the top, this would be you'd have a roll hoop above here. Your head would be like here. I did these things on my car because, on the one I actually made, because I had this metal structure as a separate thing completely out front, and I wanted to help tie the forwardmost part of this into the chassis, because it's kind of just hanging on by rivets. I don't know that I needed to do it, but I also thought they looked cool. It's something you see on a 49. It might be more necessary for strengthening this structure here where your feet are. This becomes this weird thing of, okay, what's holding up what? Is the steel holding up this, or is this holding up the steel? Remember, your suspension connects here, so the car is being held up really by these bolts where the pivots are, and then the tube comes in, and your spring shock's going to be here, and so I would probably do like I did before and weld in some brackets down here that the spring comes down to. But because of this arrangement, you don't have steel going all the way across here. This would be aluminum, and this would be flush up against it here in the front. But that would make it easy for your master cylinders. They could bolt right in there. Again, if you need bigger space than this. So one thing about this pedal box area is, because this is angling, I know from my GD40 that I can fit my feet inside 12 inches, but this is more. This is actually 13 inches out here, and you'd have a heel stop somewhere in here. So your foot would be angled here and meeting the pedals around here. So your foot isn't going to get all the way back to where it's 12 inches. It probably all the way down the pedals would be halfway down or something. So that's not quite as bad as it looks, but that is tight. Again, if you're bigger than shoe 11, size 11, you might need more space here, and so maybe you need to bring this out. If you did an inch on each side, that gives you 2 more inches, and that's quite a bit more space. You might need to make this taller. Another thing you could do, rather than just making the whole box thing taller, is rather than having these angled structures here, you could have this box angled down like that. So the top isn't flat, it angles down like that. And again, your foot would be pivoting like that. So that would give you quite a bit more room. It's just this front bulkhead is providing stiffness. You know, it's connecting one side of the car to the other. So, you know, I don't think you want this. You don't want this all the way up there, because then you don't have enough at the top connecting it there. But I guess the metal's coming down and you're connecting it here. So it's, you know, the bigger you make this, the bigger this kind of gap area is, which would reduce rigidity, but you got to do what you got to do. Again, the triangulation here, this is keeping this, again, the whole weight of the car is going to go through the pivots here if you're doing the rocker arm. The rocker arm's coming in here, the spring is down here, so this is resisting that force to keep that stiff, and then this is just keeping this above that. And then this point I mentioned, this is from the weird angle thing on the sponson going out. So I have on this one back here, it's 6 inches across here, and then it would be 6 inches at an angle here, and that brings us to that point. And so that's the tricky thing here is finding the shape you want, but then also making sure it's hitting the points you need it to hit. And I kind of didn't like when I did this, the outermost part, the widest part of this front bulkhead is down here, and I have where the rocker's going to mount up here. I would like to have this a little bit lower, but actually that looks about right for, you know, you need space for the bolt to go through and you to be able to bolt it down. Again, these are just 1-inch tubes. I would do 1/8 inch thick there because of all the forces that are going through them. But you could probably do, I mean, Lotus would have done less than 1/16 inch. On the actual 38, this whole structure is this formed sheet metal thing, and it's got formed sheet metal brackets instead of the tubes here. And they said it took like 200 man-hours to form the thing. If you look at later Lotuses, they've just got tube steel structures, which is, it's easier to make, it's easier to repair. It's simpler. It doesn't take 200 man-hours. So that's what I've used. At the end of the day, I'm just a guy with some simple metal around that I can stick together. Again, I'll put the links to all these things in the description so you can look at them. And last minute addition, I forgot to talk about this. These numbers here on the plans, this is so when I'm making the curves, I can make them repeatable. This R is the radius, so this is a 6-inch radius here. This is 7-inch, this is an 8.5-inch radius. This down here, these are, all three of these are 18.5-inch radiuses. Up here, 36-inch radius, transitioning to an 8.5. This is actually just straight. And then same, this side's obviously the same as this side. But just so you know what these numbers here are. But then outside of that, if you need the dimensions for any of this, just count the squares. Each one's a 1/4 inch, so 4 squares is an inch. So I hope that helps. You know, if you're going out there and doing your own car, I don't expect you to be able to take these plans and do this exactly because there's things you can't quite tell from them. But it's giving you all the dimensions. Like if you're going to make a space frame, you just need to know the outer extremities and just kind of a general sense of scale. This should get you right on the money, and hopefully just give you ideas on how you can do it, and maybe see how something simple and dumb that I did actually worked. So you're like, oh, well, I can do better than that. One other thing, there's a question I keep getting over and over again, and it's information that I actually filmed in previous videos and it got edited out. But I get a lot of questions about, did I use adhesive between the panels that I riveted? And no, I didn't on the 38. The original 38 didn't use adhesive between the panels. I believe that came into fashion with Robin Hurd at McLaren because he had come from the aircraft industry, and Gordon Kopeck. It seems to be the kind of thing that multiple people were figuring out at the same time. Using adhesive is a great thing to do. I had intended to use adhesive on it, and I just thought, you know, I don't expect this car to work the first time out, and if I use adhesive, when I have to take it apart to redo it because I didn't get it right, I'm going to have to deal with the adhesive. And so I didn't use it. I just used rivets. But obviously I used a ton of rivets. But I can tell you, I've had the car for 7 years now. It's probably done 30 events. It probably gets more wear and tear riding around on the trailer, the 100 and so miles between tracks and events, bouncing around on the trailer. But I've had 0 rivets. They're high quality rivets. They're not stuff you get from Home Depot or Harbor Freight. I haven't had any rivets work loose. And one of the great things is I can tell from it being painted where there's like a steel structure that's been riveted to the aluminum, or even 2 pieces of aluminum. I can see the paint over it and the paint hasn't cracked there. So I know there isn't any movement going on there. If you've got adhesive though, great, use it. It'll make it stronger. One of the things that I do as a compromise is I use regular automotive motor mounts, which usually in race cars you use something more solid. But I like the ones with the rubber in between because that's going to dampen vibrations, which I'm concerned about vibrations working rivets loose. So if you're using adhesive, that's less of a concern. So there were things that I worried about with my rivets, but I'm just trying to say I haven't had any problems. You don't have to use it, but it's a great thing to use. So if you've got it, use it. And yeah, I hope all this has been helpful, and I hope it helps you get out and do something even better than what I did. And I've got a new video coming out on the car I'm working on right now, the design that I'm a little more interested in, and I'm really excited about it. So check that out when it comes out. If you haven't seen it, I did a video on GT40 chassis just kind of in general, which has some nice design elements in it and just how simple it is to put a chassis together. And then I did an intro video, which if you haven't seen, it kind of goes along with this, where I talk about some general whys of how chassis design evolved and why things are the way they are. And if you didn't understand something I was saying here, that might help you out. It might not. I've just finished editing it, and I noticed I didn't say things as well as I could have in some things. I'm sorry about that, but I hope it helps. If not, if something seems too confusing, Google it, get a book. They'll tell you better than I can. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.